All right, welcome everybody. People are still slowly joining the call, but I think we can start now with welcome everybody to the first launch talk of our series, of our policy brief series, Feminist Perspectives for Supporting Ukraine. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this event today. We will be discussing our first policy brief, which was written by Dr. Maryna Shevtsova, who's also kindly joining us today. But before I introduce her to you, I would like to mention a few housekeeping words, just so you know how this launch talk is going to go about. We'll start with a presentation from Maryna, who will introduce us to her research. And then afterwards, I will direct a couple of questions to Maryna. And then finally, there will also be the Q&A, during which all of you will also have the chance to participate and to ask questions or share comments. Now you might have already noticed that we have disabled the camera and the microphone. That's basically just because we're recording this event to then post online for everybody to see who couldn't join us live today. But you are still very welcome to participate, and you can just do that by using the Q&A function, which is built into Microsoft Teams. You should find it at the very top of your monitor. And yeah, with that being said, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Maryna Shevtsova, who has written the policy brief that we'll be discussing today. She is a senior postdoctoral fellow at KU Leuven, a university in Belgium. She actually obtained her PhD from Humboldt University here in Berlin. And she does a lot of research on LGBTQ rights and activism, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe. She's also published before extensively on the intersection of LGBTQ rights and migration. And I think that is a very good fit with the topic that we want to discuss today, which is a queer perspective on internal displacement in Ukraine ever since the full-scale invasion started 2 years ago. And yeah, with that being said, I think I will just hand it over to Maryna. I'm sure everybody's already excited for your presentation. And yeah, afterwards, we'll talk again.
Thank you very much, Niklas, for the generous presentation. And I wanted to start with, of course, extending a warm thank you to you and to Global Public Policy Institute for creating this event and providing us with a platform to promote Ukrainian voices in different languages and both, in written and oral form. And I hope this will lead also to some next steps that will improve life of vulnerable groups in Ukraine. I'll start now sharing my presentation. Just a second. All right. And I'll start with this short presentation. And of course, I do warmly invite everyone to read the full text of the policy brief, which is also not too long because it is only as much as you can put in 15 minutes talk. But I will try to be efficient here. I would like to start with outlining the context that Ukrainian LGBTQ plus community had to deal with before the large-scale invasion that started in February 2022. The important thing to mention is that despite, I would say, incredible progress that LGBTQ plus people made in Ukraine with the support of many European institutions and international partners, still by February 2 years ago, LGBTQ people and Roma people were two most marginalized groups in the society, which is confirmed by multiple surveys and research and by experts in the field. Which means that they faced on the daily basis a lot of discrimination and harassment with access to such basic needs as housing, employment markets, high quality healthcare or LGBTQ-friendly healthcare, education, and homo and transphobic violence. This was exacerbated by quite limited legislation that Ukraine had and still has on LGBTQ plus people's protection, which on the one hand only existed in the form of a couple of legislative acts, that are far from being perfect themselves, but also lack of implementations of those legislative acts. So even if there were cases that would theoretically be could be regulated and where the human rights defenders could proceed with LGBTQ people's right violation in Ukraine, very low trust, and it has a very fair justification, very low trust of LGBTQ people in police forces, in court system, judicial system, and in the attitude of public authorities, led to the fact that they preferred to silence their problems and not to report about homo and transphobic crimes. The attitudes in the society were also quite conservative. The last survey that we have is before the large-scale invasion is from 2016, and in 2016 only 30 plus with 34, if I'm not mistaken, % of the population thought or agreed with the fact that LGBTQ people deserved to have the same human rights as other Ukrainians. You also could hear a lot of homophobic statements on media, quite homophobic tendencies were also in the government. Zelensky government, despite our expectations or contrary to our expectations, was even more homophobic and conservative with regard to LGBTQ people than previous Poroshenko government. So as I said, despite all the activism and all the efforts, we still could observe quite a sad picture. At the same time, it is worth noting that Ukraine had a very professional or highly professionalized LGBTQ plus NGO community. And this is, of course, on the one hand, their own the progress that we owe to the long work and tireless work of LGBTQ plus activists, but also to the support of international community and international donors, which, on the other hand, led to the fact that, unfortunately, Ukrainian LGBTQ plus organizations are almost fully dependent on foreign funding. And of course, on the one hand, we are talking about this generous support. On the other hand, we cannot talk about the sustainability of Ukrainian LGBTQ plus NGOs, and we also can be quite critical about the priorities that they set for themselves, and also we understand which risks they face shall this foreign funding, shrink. Now, what happened or what changed for LGBTQ plus people in general in Ukraine after the large-scale invasion started? First of all, of course, already LGBTQ people, as I said, were marginalized and oppressed. So for them, and as for all the other vulnerable groups, non-surprisingly, the existing inequalities increased. So whoever was or found themselves in a vulnerable situation, they faced higher challenges than other Ukrainians. So of course, the tragedy was common. And the first and most important change that LGBTQ people dealt with was large displacement and forced migration outside of Ukraine for those who could do that, because you know that men from 18 to 60-year-olds, except with some exceptions, are banned from leaving the country. But also internal displacement. You know that one of the justifications of the large-scale invasion used by the Kremlin was actually to protect traditional human values. And there was a lot of homophobic attacks rhetorically at the level of international fora or Twitters by some public officials like Dmitry Medvedev. But also we have documented cases of torture, of physical and sexual violence by Russian occupants of LGBTQ plus people or people who were taken for LGBTQ plus people or queer people in the occupied areas or now deoccupied, such as Kherson, such as Bucha, and so on. And we only know very little about these cases, again, because people are afraid to report such cases, because many of them didn't survive in such cases and it was not documented. There were rumors about the lists of the activists, and particularly LGBTQ activists, that the Russian soldiers had to go after on the occupied territories. So it is not surprising that those who could and those who managed left their home cities and rural areas, especially those located closer to the eastern and southern parts, which were occupied first. And of course, once this happens to you, once you have to leave your home, the main challenges that you face are safe housing, food, access to healthcare, sources of income, and basic safety. And these, of course, are challenges that are not only LGBTQ plus people or displaced LGBTQ people faced, but this is also something that many Ukrainians have to deal with. But again, due to the fact that these were already problems of LGBTQ plus community in Ukraine before February 2022, the situation worsened significantly. Finally, I would like to address also or mention also the groups within the groups which suffered the most. For example, if we talk about IDPs who had to look for new housing or a new healthcare provider in their new city or new town, of course, some of them could hide their sexual orientation or gender identity. And it is still important to mention that actually internally displaced people, unfortunately, are still discriminated only based on the fact that they are internally displaced people coming from eastern areas around Ukraine. So this is being displaced is already one of the additional reasons to be discriminated. And if you, in addition to that, have other, if you have other characteristics such as an HIV positive status, gender non-conforming appearance, being trans person with the documents that are still have your old gender markers. This all leads to additional discrimination, being rejected certain services, being rejected access to basic things that you need to survive. So among the groups who suffered the most, and this is not non-exhaustive list, of course, are also people with disabilities, are sex workers, intersex people, and so on. The list can go on and on. Now, if we address the specific problems of queer IDPs, again, as one of the groups within the groups, of course, one is what I said is the discrimination when trying to find the housing and when trying to access certain services. Another thing is that because of that, they are largely dependent on foreign humanitarian aid. And here, of course, after 2 years, we thought that we would observe a decrease in dependence on dependence of such people on foreign humanitarian aid, because people would adjust, people would find new sources of income and work. But it is important to say that there are some areas, some deoccupied areas or some rural areas where, unfortunately, with all the motivation a person may have, it is impossible to find any work. It is impossible to to find something which could cover your basic living costs, and people cannot even leave those areas simply because they have to take care of an elderly or sick relative, because they have their partner who cannot leave for some reason, or for many other reasons. Sometimes it is just anxiety and fear of evacuation. There are some people still in Kherson who cannot move simply because they cannot even walk outside of their apartment because they fear to be beaten, to be violated and attacked. Access to healthcare is another specific problem, especially for people who have different documents from their gender expression, or in principle for trans people, even with change documents, because of course once you are at the new place you have to go to a new clinic and you have to disclose your gender identity, and you have to talk about your specific health conditions. Unfortunately, in Ukraine already the number of trans-friendly doctors and LGBTQ-friendly doctors is quite short. But with the war situation, many doctors left the country. Some doctors are overworked because they have to accommodate the needs of people suffering from the the soldiers and veterans. So with this shortened list, there are also such specific problems as the deficit with hormones, and here particularly trans men suffer. There are more hormones being supplied by friendly organizations from abroad for trans women, but not for trans men. There are also unwritten rules about restricting the transition. So it's when trans people basically are being denied without the explanation, the access to doctors who could give them the medical reference that would allow them to change the document and to proceed with gender reassignment. Economic problems. Most of people who were internally displaced did not have a work that they could continue doing remotely, because also very often their employers suffered in their hometown or home region. Of course, some could find new source of income, some new work opportunity, but for majority of people, this is very difficult. And again, especially for those whose documents are different from their appearance. Therefore, of course, one of the first solutions that could be there, and we could talk about that later, would be to find options how to increase employability and how to build new work opportunity for such people. Homo and transphobic violence is something to be mentioned. There are different opinions on that. There are opinions on the fact saying that there are less cases actually documented of homo and transphobic violence in the society, which is also partially explained by the improved attitude to LGBTQ people documented among Ukrainians in the last 2 years. However, there are several factors that need to be taken in consideration. One is that there are much fewer LGBTQ events that would be visible. And if there are no visible LGBTQ events, and this is because of the military situation in the country, there are less events to attack. Secondly, many people who would normally attack LGBTQ people, such as right-wing radical groups members, they are now at the front line. So again, they're busy with something else, protecting the country, and they cannot attack LGBTQ people in a peaceful life. Thirdly, there is a fear that if you attack a person, and it will be not seen, unfortunately, in Ukraine still as a hate crime, but you can be arrested for hooliganism, and this will increase your chances of receiving a call up to the military. So this would be another justification for or explanation for why some people decide against it. At the same time, we do have increased militarization and tension within the society, and we can easily expect that already now. Last week, we had actually several documented cases in Kiev when LGBTQ people, especially young people, were attacked. But we have all the reasons to expect that the situation will worsen in the nearest future. And finally, there is a fear of collapse to the military among queer IDPs too, because of course there are many people who are, based on their documents, being men, can be easily called up to the military, and there, well, first of all, of course, they can be killed there, but secondly, if not, there is a fear of sexual harassment, homo and transphobic violence in the military, because unfortunately, not all the military groups are becoming more tolerant. So to wrap up, I would like to mention several main concerns voiced by NGOs I interviewed writing this report. And the first one, of course, is shrinking humanitarian assistance and funding space overall. Indeed, what I hear from many LGBTQ activists working now with emergency funding is that some donors already voice their plans to leave Ukraine because they believe that it's been enough time and already enough humanitarian assistance was provided. Yet, as I mentioned before, in some regions, unfortunately, the question of dependence on humanitarian assistance cannot be just solved, by telling people go and find yourself a new work or new employment opportunity. So this is a concern that leads to anxiety, worries, and panic among LGBTQ population. Second, this is that Ukraine is losing, and particularly eastern and southern areas, human resources, and organizations are losing their volunteer and activist potential. Of course, many LGBTQ people were among the first to leave because of the threat to their safety that I mentioned. But this also means that for those organizations that stayed there and that continue working, they lost a lot of trained activists and a lot of motivated and trained volunteers. So this is something that they need to rebuild and renew. Then there is a lack of incentives, program infrastructure policies for LGBTQ plus people, IDPs in particular and in general. And this is the lack of incentives both from the side of Ukrainian government, or there I would say zero such incentives of programs, but also unfortunately lack and often overlooking this specific group by some humanitarian organizations acting in Ukraine. At the same time, there is increased load of monitoring and reporting. So there is growing distrust, apparently, by humanitarian organizations in work and the accountability of Ukrainian activists, which upsets me a lot because it leads to increased workload and increased frustration among the people who already work 24/7. However, now they need to report every week, and sometimes the reporting requirements are quite against the logic and common sense. And finally, there is a lack of interaction with Ukrainian government. So even those institutions and those groups that were responsive and engaging in a dialogue with Ukrainian LGBTQ activists, they unfortunately now are much more closed for cooperation due to the fact that they're busy with military administrations because of the martial law and so on. So there are only few cases, as for example in Asovson, Ukrainian MP who submitted a bill on same-sex unions to the parliament, and a couple of others. The rest, unfortunately, are not there. They're not interacting with LGBTQ organizations, and which leads me to the major question, of course, how then can we ensure that LGBTQ people can be present and can be included into the effort and into the plans of Ukrainian recovery and Ukrainian rebuilding? And I will stop on this. Stand with Ukraine. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maryna, for this really interesting introduction. I think your analysis highlights so many important points, and also just for me as a scholar of the intersection of gender and conflict, I think we've done a lot of progress in terms of looking at the gender dimension of conflict, but just reading your paper and now also listening to you kind of underlined to me that we need to pay much more attention to the queer dimension of conflict and the consequences of conflict, because I think you have demonstrated very, very impressively that this is something that we need to understand better in order also then to improve policy. Which also directly links to my first question, because now in your presentation, we've heard a lot about the problems that currently exist and about the specific challenges for queer IDPs in your policy brief, and I would still recommend to everybody to read it. There is also a very long section on recommendations, specifically targeted at international actors. And so I wanted to ask you, what can international actors do to better address these specific challenges? And then also, what are some of the low-hanging fruits? And then on the other side, what are some of the problems that need a longer-term, more structural answer?
Thank you both for your feedback and for an important question, I believe. And of course, when I talk about the short-term and immediate solutions that are needed, one is I understand that it sounds not maybe appealing to the international community, but I think one is still not to cut funding going to the so-called emergency funds and humanitarian assistance, because as I repeated several times during the report, this is something that will be needed for next year at least, but also to invest, which is now not being done enough, I would say, far from being enough, into building more or opening more, not building, opening more shelters specifically for LGBTQ people and specifically for trans people, for lesbian women, because now the capacity of existing shelters in Ukraine is barely a couple of hundreds, not even thousands, people. So which means that that people who need shelter urgently, they often live in conditions like 20 people in one room, sleeping on these gymnastic mats. And this may be okay for a couple of days when you run from bombing, but this is not okay when you have to stay in the place, and when it is expected that you will integrate, that you will find new work opportunity. I think it's far from being realistic. So this is something that is urgently needed, as well as continuing psychological support. Unfortunately, this is the big direction, or a hole which needs to be filled with resources. Unfortunately, the demand for psychological and psychiatric support, including medicines, which are now not covered by any of the donors officially. So none of the donors actually covers the medicines against depression, antidepressants, and other medicines for mental health issues. The demand will only be growing because the life of people is not improving, and the human psyche is quite fragile. And of course, at the same time, the employment opportunities need to be created, and they could be created, but also people need to be trained, and they need to be trained quickly. So the programs, we need new programs that could have this creative angle and train people to do things, to be able to join the market quickly, such as, for example, there are some nice examples from LGBTQ organizations, people who are trained as baristas, working in coffee shops, which are plenty in Ukraine, working as people who do manicure and pedicure services, also very on demand in Ukraine, doing massage practices, content management, SMM, so this kind of stuff. And this is something that needs to be done now and continuously until the war is there. And if we talk about the long-term recommendation, and something again which donors don't like to invest for years. But I think this is something that we will need to be again covered for years, is education or training, because even when we have, hopefully after the pressure from the European institutions, all the legislation in place, the implementation then fails only exactly because of the human factor. And this is something that can be solved with one training conducted in the local city administration or one training for doctors. This needs to be developed into systematic training, education, awareness raising and informing effort, which will take, well, I would argue a decade or so, right, to shape new mentality. And I know that this is long, but this I think is totally worth investment.
Thank you. I think all of those are very, very important points that need to receive proper attention. Now, you mentioned in your policy brief, but also earlier, that there's not only a problem of where money goes, but also of the way that money is spent, so to say, donor-implementer relationships. Can you elaborate a little bit on the kinds of problems that you see there, and then also give us a glimpse into how they can be tackled?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the issues that I heard or that many NGOs are dealing with is the mismatch between the donors' priorities set for them, and this is again not something new for the war, but it again became more acute, and their vision of how their work should be. And there are two problems. So one, we see donors, unfortunately, in Ukraine switching more and more to project funding rather than offering to organizations core funding. And it used to be problematic already before the war. It's becoming more problematic now because people are already in the condition of constant anxiety, not knowing what will happen tomorrow. And when I was asking organizations about their strategic vision, I just heard people nervously laughing because they say we have money for half a year now and we have no idea what will happen next. So we want to have salaries, and their salaries are not high already. So I think that, again, this is a banal recommendation or request, but core funding, at least for 1-2 years, would be a solution, because otherwise this lack of trust into the organizations that are there, they have been there for decades, they have been operating in Ukraine, they know their communities, they have so many examples of amazing work. However, the refusal to offer to these organizations core funding, at least for some time, with flexible monitoring and reporting schemes, is quite insulting, in my opinion, and shows a little bit of patronizing attitude to civil society activists who are operating in very heavy conditions. And secondly, of course, the activities. So there also, I feel like the international donor community would benefit more from more conversations with the leaders of those organizations, open conversations, asking about what they think is needed now for the community, because of course there is again still surprisingly the emphasis on visibility, emphasis on advocacy, and these are two very important, of course, factors. But again, in the conditions of the war, these are maybe not the most pressuring issues. Not all the organizations can and should do advocacy, especially now, as I said, the government, the government is closed for cooperation, is not really eager to discuss certain things. But also there are many everyday issues to be solved. There is big request for community building, to have safe shelters, not just for people to live, but also for just to meet and to have time together, to be who they are. And I would say one of the examples of best practices is the community center that was Sfera organization in Kharkiv was allowed to buy a small house or a small apartment where they will be organizing community activities. So this is now this is their complete, like it belongs to them, so it will not be taken. They don't have to pay monthly rent. And it's also, it's that kind of stability, because otherwise all the organizations say, oh, we don't have it, we don't know if we can cover office next month, so we work from homes. So I would say this, and I think more, there is also this things that, okay, we've done research 2 years ago, now we know everything, and we stop, we continue with this. No, I think these conversations, focus groups, invitations for shadow reporting is really important on a regular basis. Now that the situation is changing so much and so often. So yeah, I think major takeaway from this is have more trust in the activists, because they've been there for long and they've done many things that we could learn from.
Thank you. And I think this is something that resonates quite a lot also with the research that we've done at GPPi, where a year ago we interviewed peace builders all over the world, and basically they told us very similar things, that they need more extension of trust, and many of the other points that you mentioned. I have one last question for you that I would like to pose, but then also I would like to now invite everybody to use the Q&A function. If you have questions for Maryna, this is now a very good opportunity to ask. And in the meantime, while you're still typing out your questions, I'll go ahead with the final one from my side, because you maybe if we're trying to look a little bit at the positive side, you mentioned that in terms of LGBTQ plus acceptance, there has been a recent upward trend, and I would be really curious to know from you what the reasons for this trend are, and then also if this constitutes sort of a window of opportunity, and how to make use of that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. That's a very surprising trend that we observed for the last 2 years, indeed. And the Ukrainian NGO Nash Suite, which is specialized on various reports on the life of LGBTQ people in Ukraine for the last couple of decades, actually. So I also can recommend their reports. They are available in English. They commissioned the sociological survey in Ukraine both in 2022 and 2023, and we observed that the number of the share of Ukrainians who now support the idea that LGBTQ people should have the same rights as heterosexual Ukrainians, so to say, increased, almost doubled, basically. So it used to be 34%, and now we have 60 plus, 63, 65%, if I'm not mistaken. So this is, of course, a major change. The explanation, how we explain this is first, of course, by the by the homophobic rhetoric and behavior of Russia and Kremlin, who are now the major enemy of Ukrainians. So for part of the population, I believe, to turn towards being more liberal and tolerant and accepting towards LGBTQ people becomes, means being less like Russians. And it has been there, this idea has been there already for a while, but of course, in the last 2 years, it became particularly present and vocal. And secondly, this is the growing visibility of such a group within LGBTQ community as LGBTQ military. The group was founded in 2015, so again, it is not new, since the war in Ukraine is not new, it's been there since 2014, but for a long time, since 2015, there were very few people who could show their faces. So they had their secret Facebook page. There were some interviews with a couple of gay soldiers, but this was it. However, last 2 years, pushed a lot of people to the front line, and many of them are, of course, LGBTQ. And for them now, it became, they have nothing to lose, basically coming out, and moreover, they feel like they need to stand for their rights. If they're ready to die for Ukraine every day, and they can die for Ukraine every day, and they are dying, then at least they want the same rights as heterosexual people, the right for having a family, to be recognized in the society. So we have in the media, we have on social media more and more photos, posts, and stories of couples or individuals who tell that I'm a trans person, I'm a lesbian person, I'm a gay, and I am in the military, and and I fight for you, I stand for you, and I deserve same rights as you have. I would like also to, because there might be a question immediately after that, I would like to stress that, of course, we'll understand that it is somewhat unstable or problematic, the fact that the support for LGBTQ people in society basically rests on these two things. Because one, right, so this emotion, this being not like Russians, it will last as long as the war is there. However, it's not something, anger and desire not to be like someone is not necessarily the best motivation for sustainable change of the attitude. And second, the fact that it's LGBTQ Ukrainian or LGBTQ military who are especially accepted, of course, also leaves us to wonder, what about other LGBTQ people? Are they worthy of the same rights? So how people perceive that? Because this would be the argumentation of some Ukrainians if you ask them about why. So what's your opinion? They would say, oh, yeah, of course, I know that they're also fighting. But people don't deserve rights only because they're fighting. They deserve their rights because, well, they're citizens of Ukraine as well as all the other people. So now, of course, our concern is how to bring awareness to this topic, how to make it self-explanatory. The fact that you don't have to be worthy of, right, acceptance. This is something that has to come to you by default.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I would start with one question from Julia Scharinger, who says, first of all, thank you for this very interesting presentations. What would you say are the main knowledge gaps on the intersection of LGBTIQA+ communities and the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I would say that there is still, in general, very little research done on this topic. So not only on the intersection of LGBTQ plus communities' life and the conflict and the war in Ukraine, but also, prior to that. So we don't know. For example, when writing the report, I was asked about numbers. How many displaced queer IDPs are there in Ukraine? Or how many are there queer refugees from Ukraine? Nobody knows. So now there is, as far as I know, the first attempt is being launched by the NGO cohort, at least to get some data about the number of trans people in Ukraine and their problems and their challenges. They're now trying to prepare a national survey. But again, those are always limited capacities. So we don't know even the basic. We cannot do we cannot imagine properly the demographic of Ukrainian LGBTQ community. And if we don't know the demographic, if we don't know who are these people, what is their class, education, where do they live, we only can make assumptions, and we make assumptions based on the facts that are related to, based on the knowledge that we have about the groups that are close to NGOs. But those are the most visible groups, right? Those are people who are informed about, first, they're informed about these NGOs, and second, they wish to interact with them. There is also a big chunk of population that is not willing to be part of this, that have distrust into NGOs, that for some reason even don't want to be identified as LGBTQ, even if there is a woman living with a woman. So this, I would say, not knowing demographics and not knowing their life conditions is the major gap. Now, if we talk specifically about the war, it is also the problem with documenting hate crimes, and particularly homo and transphobic crimes. And this is what two major organizations that do monitoring and documentation of such crimes talk about. They say that unfortunately, very often people who do that from other organizations, not specifically LGBTQ, they lack the conceptual apparatus, they lack the knowledge, and they cannot therefore distinguish all those different, discrimination, gender-based violence, homophobic violence, hate crime, and so on. So they talk a lot about additional training of those experts, monitors on this. There is demand for that. What else? Of course, we don't know anything about elderly queer population of Ukraine. We know more about teenagers because we had national school surveys for 3 years in a decade, but we have no idea what's happening with elderly or with rural, for example, LGBTQ population. So, and then this is just to start with. So you can imagine how big the gap is actually.
Since we're already on the topic of knowledge gaps and also how to fill them, I would be interested from a methodological point of view. How did you experience during the research that you did for this project, but also in general, you're doing lots of research and publish a lot. I published a lot in the last 2 years. How have you experienced doing research under these circumstances? Is it easy for you to reach the people that you desire to speak to?
So of course, I'm in a good position in this sense because I've been doing this for more than 10 years already, and I've been working with as an activist myself in an LGBTQ rights NGO. So I have a lot of so-called warm contacts. So often people would agree to talk to me because they know me personally and they know they know that they can trust me. But also, of course, activists themselves are more open to communications also with scholars. I know that I have some MA students who reached out directly to Ukrainian activists and they got interviews because people want to promote, people want to be heard. But on the one hand, on the other hand, there is definitely some interview fatigue and people are tired of speaking and, repeating the same and the same again. But still, it's the same as myself. We activists and myself, we try to speak about Ukraine as much as possible. Doesn't matter if it is to an MA student or at the conference or sometimes given an interview, because we're very much afraid that Ukraine disappears from youth outlines and that then there will be even less help and less assistance. Now, if you need to do the research with people who are not in activism, then indeed it is much more difficult. Then again, when I did this with IDPs and with refugees in the EU, this was always facilitated by my colleagues and partners from LGBTQ rights NGOs. And I have to say, very cynical fact, but this is true and we don't need to silence it. Very often what helped was to propose a honorarium. And this is something that I believe is very important because we want people to spend an hour or even 2 hours time talking about facts that re-traumatize them, that are not pleasant very often to remember, and then it is considered unethical to offer them honorarium for that. And I really question this because, it is ethical to offer people money to participate in experiments on the Faculty of Psychology when they had some diodes connected to their heads and then they get €25 check. Why this is fine and this is not fine to pay the same €25 for a person to talk about her or their experience with crossing the border. And this would encourage people. So I actively try to promote this because otherwise we contact people again and again. We basically capitalize on their knowledge and we don't give anything in return.
Thank you. This actually resonates with another policy brief that we also just published on political participation in the Kharkiv region, and there it became very obvious that lots of the humanitarian volunteering on the ground was conducted by women who, because they are socialized in gendered role models, do not ask for compensation and never expect anyone to pay for participation in all kinds of different forms of volunteering, even when it's in collaboration with international actors who would have the funds. So I think that is something also to keep in mind. There's perhaps even a gender dimension to what you just mentioned. There's also another question again from Julia Scharinger, who asks, based on your research, what recommendations would you have to international peace-building actors on how to promote the LGBTIQA+ community as active agents in peace processes?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is, to me, is quite simple. This is first, of course, to build as early as possible the relations with the community leaders in the region, for example, of Ukraine or elsewhere where they are working, and then make sure that there are always representatives of these organizations at the table and that they are also heard. Because I would say, I also heard this from in an interview with LGBTQ militaries that I conducted. They said that sometimes, because now Ukraine also is learning, so public officials are learning when they're organizing some events, they do include a panel with members of civil society organizations, and they invite everybody and they have 3 minutes to speak each. And then this is it. So there is this illusion, and I actually heard there is the same situation in Armenia now with Pashinyan. government. So they also learned to invite everybody. So there is the illusion that you're included. But then nobody cares about what you were talking during those, I don't know, half an hour in that panel room. Then this is very dangerous. So, and there, I think the role of international actors, peace building actors, could be, to make sure that it's not these words are not just left in the air hanging, but rather that are documented, and then something is being done with what recommendations were made and what claims were voiced.
Excellent, thank you. When you just mentioned these kinds of consultations, what came to my mind immediately was that in June, Germany is hosting the Ukrainian Recovery Conference, and I would be interested to hear if you have any recommendations or propositions based on your research. What should be discussed there, and then also who should get a voice?
Yeah, I think it would be great to have people from different regions, and I'm speaking, of course, now about LGBTQ people there, because another thing that I observe is that those who are more often invited are the ones from Kyiv. And this is for obvious reason, right? Because they have more contacts with international actors, and they're more visible. But who suffered most are the regions. And one, for example, I will give one example. It's not completely relevant for the forum, but it's relevant for Germany. In Berlin, there is a Russian-speaking LGBTQ rights organization working with the refugees, which is called Quartira. And this organization is positioning itself also as supporting Ukrainian refugees. And because this is a well-established organization, they seem to have all the funding, while there is Ukrainian organization Kvitne Queer, that is there since 2022 with very renowned and very hardworking activists from Kherson who evacuated hundreds of people from occupied Kherson, who did like incredible things. However, those who get voice and those who are more heard and those who get funding are again Russian activists. Okay, they're not Russian anymore. They are in Berlin, but I see this as highly problematic. So I think this more scrutiny and more attention to who gets to speak, who is overlooked, why these people who are in Germany actually and are doing incredible work in Ukraine from Germany are not there, are not often given the microphone. And the same people from Zaporizhia Gender That organization that also does amazing things. People who are working in Mykolaiv. So, and this is not that difficult, they are present online. So even worst case scenarios, it could be given the worst. So if you cannot organize the travel, if there is also men who might not be allowed to leave the country, there could be online participation. Because I do see also a certain privilege and inequality with the fact who can travel, who can cross the border, who can speak like myself, safely now from Belgium. And of course, this is a lot of extra work for organizers. I understand that. But I also think this is the work worth doing.
And I suppose this urban-rural divide that you described, that is also something that comes into play with when we look at organizations in Ukraine and who gets resources to work with IDPs. Is that a common problem that you can also observe? Can you say something about that?
Yes, of course. I also want to say that as a response to the large-scale invasion, certain grassroots initiatives emerged. And for these grassroots initiatives, it is very difficult to get funding because, well, for obvious reason, because they have barely registered an NGO or they registered it, I don't know, half a year before the large-scale invasion, so they don't have yet, a portfolio. But this could be solved, I think, by requiring urging major organizations to take these look for these smaller organizations incentives and give them sub-grants. And I see some organizations who have this opportunity or possibility to do it. They like doing it because it also increases their partner connections, alliances, and so on. But for that, again, you need the budget. And if you are even major organization, but you are in a survival mode, I don't think you will be motivated to share your piece of bread with a small young incentive group. But those who do I have very good examples, like in Lviv, Avante NGO, who on basis of Avante, we have new now LGBTQ organization Impulse that is only 2-year old. Gender Stream also trains 2 young organizations, Bilkis and trans organization Trans Resistance. So I see this trend. I see this motivation to share the knowledge and to train new younger activists who can later join like open their organizations, build up on that. But for that, again, there should be the feeling that it will not be only one grant for all, and then the one who comes first gets it. It's not I understand it. Again, it requires money, right? Money and extra work. But yeah.
Yeah, but it also requires funding modalities that make this possible. This kind of the multiplying effect that you describe. It has to be made possible as well. We only have a couple of minutes left, so if anybody has any more questions, now would be a perfect time to put them into the chat.
I see there is a question about police. We didn't answer. From Polina Lebedeva.
Can you read that out? I don't see.
Yeah. So the question is whether in the report you conclude that there needs to be investment and increase in police sensitivity toward LGBT plus issues in Ukraine. Could you expand on how you envision the concrete steps of implementing this? And yes, I can expand on this. So we have already some good examples. There are 2 organizations, Gender Stream from Dnipro and Gender Z Zaporizhia, who've been working with police in their cities or in their regions, oblasts, and offering trainings on the sensitivity, exactly on the sensitivity towards homo and transphobic violence, hate crime, sexual harassment, and all the topics. And I also want to say that there is the demand from Ukrainian police for that. And that I hear from activists that in general, the demand is there. Of course, there are some older structures that are very difficult to shake, but younger generation in particular, they want to learn more and they're curious and are more open-minded. However, again, yes, there are two obstacles here. So one, okay, again, funding, but second is the entry point. So sometimes you have the demand from police who are there patrolling, and then there is somebody on the top who thinks that this is useless, and this is the same we face with educators working in schools. If there is a headmaster who thinks that we shouldn't make a propaganda of LGBTs, and no matter how teachers want to hear about that, we will not be allowed to school to do the training, and the same with the police. So here, I think, in addition to the to helping the activists to create these projects activities, there is also need in kind of facilitating these entry points, which could be done in cooperation with the government. Maybe sometimes even presenting it as something that would send this European values message to Brussels and so on, because this is something that works very well in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. It appears that my Q&A didn't update. In fact, we have a couple more questions, and since we have 7 more minutes, I would say that we go for them. The first one is by Christina, who thanks you for your insight, and then points out that there are other groups such as women-led groups, women rights organizations, so forth. And asks if that could be used as a base for solidarity and mutual advocacy with other groups that also face other dimensions of marginalization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think this is a great point. It doesn't, unfortunately, and it sounds very logical, right? For some reason, it doesn't always translate into reality. What I observe now for the last 2 years, but also before the large-scale invasion, is that these are mostly women-led organizations, women-led LGBTQ rights organizations that are much more keen on solidarizing and building alliances and helping women. So most of organizations that are women-led, such as Insight, such as Gender Stream, such as Sfera in Kharkov, such as Insha in Kherson, and now evacuated from Kherson, they all been first LGBTQ rights organizations. They all also provided help to women, also now providing humanitarian assistance and shelters and so on. So women are included as special category. And then, of course, they also, as it happens, women's organizations within LGBTQ organizations are more attentive to the issue of intersectionality, vulnerable groups within vulnerable groups, and so on. We do have, though, some examples of also the cooperation of non-women-led organizations with other vulnerable groups. For example, in Lviv, there is, for me, very interesting alliance between and young LGBTQ rights NGO and Jewish youth NGO, which cooperated a lot, accepting displaced people, internally displaced people. But unfortunately, probably this is it. And the reason for that is that our civil society is still quite fragmented. And there are certain tensions. There is competition for resources and fear that that if there is, if you apply for the same together for funding, who gets the main role and so on. But there is understanding at the same time that the alliances are needed. So we will see how it will develop.
Thank you. And then we have one last question from my colleague Julia, who wants to go back to the question of knowledge gap and specifically wants to ask about Russian occupation, because you mentioned that the situation for LGBTQ+ was very difficult. And Julia wants to know if there's any ongoing efforts to find out more about this, for instance, in deoccupied areas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope that there is more effort than what I know of. Unfortunately, so it might be out of the sphere of my knowledge that international humanitarian organizations, those who are documenting war crimes, I hope that they pay more attention to that. There is not that much written about that so far in existing reports and articles, but I hope that maybe this is because of the sensitivity of the issue. There is efforts done by the monitors of LGBTQ rights NGOs in those areas, but unfortunately their capacities are quite limited because of restricted mobility well, and when I say monitors, there might be, for example, one monitor per oblast, yeah. So, and oblast is quite big. So usually this is not that this person would go personally to this deoccupied village and talk to people there. It is all through connections, through contacts, through personal contacts, and so on. So, for example, when we talk about the occupied Kherson, there, the activists who are now in Kiev and in Berlin, they do have still network of those who survived and who stayed there. So they collect stories. I know that, for example, they have documented on video accidentally. So the office of INSHA NGO was attacked during the occupation and destroyed, and they had a CCTV camera in there. So it was recorded, and they have the recording of what was happening with those who did it, and they plan to send it to submit it together with our documents. So yes, there is an effort. I think that is still not really enough, but I might be mistaken. Maybe there is something that is not that on the surface.
And if not, that leaves more work for us to do, more research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Maryna, for taking the time to talk to us about your policy brief and all the super relevant and interesting research that you're doing. It's really been, really thought-provoking and interesting to hear a talk about it. And I would also like to thank everybody for attending. If you wish to read Maryna's policy brief, then it's online on our website, both in English and Ukrainian. If you have friends that read Ukrainian, then please do forward the Ukrainian version. Also, Maryna just published a book, which I highly recommend, Feminist Perspectives on Russia's Full-Scale Invasion of Ukraine. I very much recommend taking a look at that as well. And I would also like to extend our thanks to the stabilization platform at the German Federal Foreign Office, who kindly funds the project, the policy brief series, which this launch talk is part of. With that being said, thank you very much, Maryna.
Thank you very much for having me and for everyone who joined us. It was a pleasure.